Have you ever heard of a countess accused of murdering hundreds of young women,
Oh, yeah.
all in a quest for eternal youth?
Wow.
Her name is Elizabeth Bathory, and her story is as captivating as it is controversial.
Absolutely.
We're diving into the heart of this historical mystery
Right.
to uncover whether she was truly a bloodthirsty monster or the victim of a sinister plot.
A fascinating case for sure. What's particularly intriguing is that the most iconic image associated with Elizabeth I of her bathing in the blood of her victims is a complete fabrication.
Really?
Oh, yeah. This myth emerged over a century after her death and was likely fueled by religious and political agendas.
So right off the bat, we're dealing with a story that's been heavily embellished.
Yeah.
But before we get to the accusations, let's rewind and understand who Elizabeth Bathory actually was.
Right.
She was born into one of the most powerful families in 16th century Hungary,
The Bathories.
a family that could make or break kings.
And their influence wasn't limited to Hungary.
Yeah.
Elizabeth was also related to the Transylvanian nobility, a region constantly vying for independence from the Habsburg Empire.
Oh, I see.
This family connection placed Elizabeth right in the middle of a power struggle
Yeah.
that would ultimately shape her destiny.
It sounds like she was born into a world of privilege and political intrigue,
Yes,
but I understand her childhood wasn't without its struggles.
that's right. Elizabeth suffered from a condition that was likely epilepsy,
Ah.
causing seizures that would have been terrifying in a time when medical understanding was limited.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine, instead of medication,
Yeah.
she might have endured treatments like bloodletting or trepanation drilling holes in the skull to release evil spirits.
Oh, gosh.
These practices, while considered cutting edge back then, could have been seen as barbaric
Right.
and might have shaped her perception of suffering and pain.
That's a chilling thought. It definitely adds another layer to understanding Elizabeth's character.
I think so.
But those struggles aside, she eventually went on to marry Ferenc Nadezhdy, another powerful figure in Hungary.
Yes, their marriage wasn't a love match, but a strategic alliance
Okay.
that united two of the most influential families in the region.
I see.
It's important to understand that in those times,
Yeah.
marriages among the nobility were primarily about consolidating power and expanding land holdings.
So Elizabeth wasn't just a wealthy countess. She was a key player in the Game of Thrones, so to speak.
Right.
And when her husband died in 1604, she inherited vast estates and became an even more significant figure.
Precisely. And that's where the story takes a dark turn.
Uh-oh.
Just 6 years after becoming a widow,
Yeah.
Elizabeth found herself at the center of a scandal that would forever tarnish her name.
Okay, let's get into those accusations.
Yeah.
What exactly was Elizabeth accused of?
In 1610, György Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, essentially the king's right-hand man, launched an investigation into Elizabeth,
Okay.
following rumors of unimaginable cruelty.
Like,
She was accused of torturing and murdering hundreds of young women,
wow.
primarily servant girls who lived and worked in her various castles.
Hundreds of victims. That's a staggering number. What kind of evidence did they have to support such a horrific claim?
Well, that's where things get murky.
Okay.
The investigation relied heavily on witness testimonies, many of which were obtained under duress or influenced by leading questions.
Oh, wow.
Imagine being a peasant interrogated by powerful officials about your mistress, a woman with ties to royalty.
Yeah,
Wouldn't you be inclined to say what you thought they wanted to hear?
absolutely. It sounds like the investigation might have been less about uncovering the truth and more about securing a conviction.
Yeah.
But there must have been something that triggered this investigation in the first place.
Sure.
What sparked those initial rumors?
There are accounts of a young servant girl trying to escape from Elizabeth's castle, falling to her death.
Oh.
Some whispered that Elizabeth had struck her,
Gosh.
but others claimed it was an accident.
Okay.
There were also stories of strange rituals and screams heard coming from the castle at night. These whispers, fueled by fear and superstition, eventually reached the ears of György Thurzo, who saw an opportunity to potentially eliminate a powerful rival.
So we have a powerful widow, rumors of dark deeds, and a political figure with potential motives to discredit her.
It's all there.
Sounds like the stage was set for a dramatic downfall.
Indeed. And the way Thurzo conducted his investigation only added fuel to the fire.
Really?
He presented a decomposing body, supposedly one of Elizabeth's victims, as proof of her brutality.
Oh.
But what many people didn't know was that this body had been buried for months.
Oh, wow.
Likely a victim of the plague that was ravaging the region at the time.
It sounds like Thurzo was determined to paint Elizabeth as a monster, regardless of the truth. But surely Elizabeth had a chance to defend herself.
Sadly, no. She was denied a proper trial, never given an opportunity to present her own evidence or question the accusations against her.
Really?
Thurzo claimed this was to spare her family further shame,
Oh.
but it also conveniently prevented any official record of her side of the story.
So instead of a fair trial, she was placed under house arrest in her own castle, essentially condemned without a chance to clear her name.
Exactly. And that's where the legend of the Blood Countess began to solidify.
Hmm.
With no chance to defend herself, Elizabeth became an easy target for gossip and speculation.
Right.
The rumors morphed into gruesome tales, and the image of her bathing in the blood of her victims became a macabre symbol of her alleged cruelty.
It's incredible how quickly a story can spiral out of control, especially when it involves power intrigue and a healthy dose of fear.
Yeah.
But before we get too caught up in the sensationalism,
Okay.
let's step back and examine the accusations themselves.
Okay.
Were there any alternative explanations for the deaths attributed to Elizabeth?
That's where the work of Dr. Irma Sadecki-Cardos comes in.
Okay.
This Hungarian scholar has spent years digging into the historical records,
Yeah.
challenging the accepted narrative and uncovering some fascinating details
Right.
that shed new light on Elizabeth's case.
Okay, let's hear it.
Yeah.
What did Dr. Sadecki-Cardos discover?
Well, for starters, she points out that many of the alleged tortures attributed to Elizabeth were actually common medical practices of the time, especially in Transylvania.
Oh, really?
For example, one of the accusations against Elizabeth involved piercing the fingertips of young women with needles.
Oh my gosh.
It sounds horrific.
Definitely. It
But-
sounds like something out of a horror movie.
But in reality, this was a treatment for a condition known as fingernail poison,
Huh?
a painful ailment that was fairly common back then. Elizabeth was known to employ healers and herbalists to care for her servants.
Right.
So it's entirely possible that these tortures were actually misguided attempts at medical care.
That's a fascinating point.
Yeah.
It's amazing how easily a seemingly innocent act can be twisted into something sinister when viewed through the lens of suspicion and prejudice.
Exactly. And it's not just the needle piercing. Dr. Sadecki-Cardos points out that other tortures attributed to Elizabeth, like using stinging nettles or applying ice to wounds, were actually folk remedies commonly used in Transylvania at that time. These treatments might seem harsh to us now,
Yeah.
but they were considered normal back then.
So we have a woman who is providing health care, using practices that were considered standard at the time, suddenly being accused of sadistic torture.
Right.
It makes you wonder if there's more to this story than meets the eye.
There's definitely more to unpack here, and that's what makes this case so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's a puzzle with missing pieces. A story that's been shaped by rumor, political agendas, and centuries of interpretation.
And that's what we're here for, to delve into the evidence separate fact from fiction and try to understand the truth behind the legend of Elizabeth Bathory.
Exactly.
Welcome back. We're deep in the heart of the Elizabeth Bathory mystery, trying to separate fact from fiction.
A tough one for sure.
And one of the most persistent accusations is this whole bloodbath thing.
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
Was there any truth to that, or is it just a gruesome fabrication?
The image of Elizabeth bathing in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth is one of the most enduring aspects of her legend. But it's a myth that originated over a century after her death, with no basis in any of the contemporary accounts or witness testimonies from her time.
It's amazing how a story can evolve over time, taking on a life of its own. But if it wasn't true, how did this bloodbath idea become so ingrained in her story?
It seems the bloodbath myth first appeared in the writings of a Hungarian Jesuit priest in the early 18th century. This was during the Counter-Reformation, a period when the Catholic Church was actively pushing back against the spread of Protestantism. Elizabeth, having converted to Protestantism, became a convenient target for demonization.
So they essentially turned her into a cautionary tale,
Right.
a way to scare people away from Protestantism by associating it with depravity and evil.
Precisely. And unfortunately, this sensationalized version of Elizabeth's story, the one with the bloodbath and the insatiable thirst for youthful beauty, has become the dominant narrative. It's overshadowed the more nuanced historical reality, the one where a powerful woman was caught in a web of political intrigue and religious tensions.
It makes you wonder how much of history is shaped by those in power, those who control the narrative. But even if we set aside the bloodbath myth, there were still hundreds of deaths attributed to Elizabeth. How does Dr. Sadecki-Cardos account for those?
One of her most compelling arguments is that many of the alleged murders coincided with outbreaks of disease, particularly the plague, which was rampant in Hungary during Elizabeth's lifetime.
So are you suggesting that some of the deaths attributed to Elizabeth were actually caused by the plague?
That's a strong possibility, and it wouldn't be the first time in history that a scapegoat was needed during a time of widespread fear and panic.
Right.
People were desperate for answers for someone to blame, and Elizabeth, with her wealth, power, and unconventional practices, fit the bill perfectly.
It's certainly a more plausible explanation than a countess bathing in blood to stay young. But let's play devil's advocate for a moment. Even if some of the deaths were due to the plague, there were still a lot of disturbing testimonies about Elizabeth's cruelty. How do we reconcile those accounts with the image of her as a woman providing medical care?
That's where we have to consider the context of the time. What might seem shocking or barbaric to us today was considered normal in 16th century. Hungry discipline among servants was often harsh, and physical punishments were commonplace.
So are you saying that Elizabeth might have been cruel by our standards, but not necessarily unusual for her time?
It's possible we can't erase the testimonies of those who claim to have witnessed or experienced her cruelty, but we also have to acknowledge that those testimonies were given under very specific circumstances in a climate of fear and accusation.
It's a reminder that history isn't always black and white. It's often a tapestry of shades of gray where truth and perception intertwine.
Exactly. And in Elizabeth's case, that tapestry is woven with threads of political ambition, religious zealotry, and the very real possibility that a powerful woman was targeted and silenced for challenging the status quo.
So where does that leave us? After examining the evidence, the rumors, and the historical context, what can we reasonably conclude about Elizabeth Bathory? Was she a cold-blooded killer, a victim of circumstance, or something in between?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There's no easy answer, no smoking gun that definitively proves her guilt or innocence. We're left with a historical puzzle pieces that fit together to form a picture, but one that remains incomplete.
It's tempting to want a clear-cut resolution, a definitive answer to the question of whether Elizabeth Bathory was a monster or a victim. But maybe the real value lies in embracing the ambiguity, in acknowledging that history is rarely neat and tidy.
Absolutely. And in that ambiguity and those unanswered questions, we find the space for critical thinking, for questioning our assumptions, and for appreciating the complexities of the human experience.
Yeah. Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the enigma of Elizabeth Bathory. Was she a victim of circumstance, a ruthless killer, or a product of her time? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. We'll be back after a quick break to discuss some additional resources that might help you continue your own deep dive into this captivating historical mystery. We've spent this episode unpacking the story of Elizabeth Bathory, exploring the accusations, the evidence, and the historical context that shaped her legend. But as with any good historical mystery, there's always more to learn.
Yeah, for sure. That's one of the things I find so fascinating about history. It's a never-ending journey of discovery. And with Elizabeth Bathory, there are so many avenues to explore further.
Absolutely. So for our listeners who are now completely hooked on this case, what's one thing they can do to continue their own deep dive?
Well, if you're interested in the primary sources, there are a number of books and articles that compile the original trial documents and witness testimonies. Reading those firsthand accounts, however flawed they might be, can give you a real sense of the atmosphere and the complexities of the case.
That's a great suggestion. It's always fascinating to go back to the original sources and try to interpret them for yourself. What about books or articles that offer alternative perspectives on Elizabeth's story? Are there any resources you'd recommend?
Dr. Sadis Gicardos' work is definitely a must-read for anyone looking to challenge the traditional narrative. Her book, The Bathory Family and the Countess Elizabeth, delves deep into the family history, the political landscape, and the medical practices of the time, providing a much more nuanced understanding of Elizabeth's world.
I've heard great things about that book. I'll
Yeah.
definitely have to check it out. And for those who are more visually inclined, are there any documentaries or films about Elizabeth Bathory?
There have been quite a few documentaries and films made about her, but it's important to approach them with a critical eye. Some tend to sensationalize the story, focusing on the bloodbath myth and portraying her as a one-dimensional monster. Others take a more balanced approach, exploring the historical context and the possibility of her innocence. Do your research and find one that aligns with your interest in a more factual and nuanced perspective.
That's good advice. It's always important to be mindful of the source and to consider the potential biases that might be shaping the narrative. So before we wrap up, is there a final thought-provoking question we can leave our listeners with?
Here's one. If Elizabeth Bathory were alive today, how would her story be told? Would she be a tabloid sensation, a subject of true crime podcasts, or a feminist icon reclaiming her narrative?
Mhm.
How would our modern understanding of mental health, gender roles, and power dynamics shape our perception of her actions?
That's an excellent question.
Hmm.
It really challenges us to think about how our own present-day perspectives influence the way we interpret the past. And maybe by asking that question, we can gain a deeper understanding not only of Elizabeth Bathory, but also of ourselves and the stories we tell about the world around us.
Exactly. The past is never truly past. It shapes who we are and how we see the world. And sometimes the most enduring historical mysteries are the ones that force us to confront our own biases and assumptions.
Well said. So for all of you history buffs, mystery lovers, and truth seekers out there, keep questioning, keep exploring, and never stop digging for the stories that lie beneath the surface. Until next time, happy deep diving.